Hello, I'm Katie Steckles.
And I'm Peter Rowlett. And so what's our mathematical object?
Today our mathematical object is it's the Pseudorhombicuboctahedron.
Of course.
Of course. So this is a shape which is not included in a category of shapes that I feel it should be included in. And this is one of these things that with 2D and 3D shapes, mathematicians love to categorise and give things labels and definitions. So you may have heard of platonic solids, which are the five sort of really nice regular shapes made out of regular polygons. So things like equilateral triangles, squares, regular pentagons. And a platonic solid is one which is made up only out of the same type of regular polygon, and all of the faces and all of the corners of the shape are identical. So whichever way around you put it, it looks exactly the same. And there are only 5 of them. They're all familiar shapes that you may have heard of: cube, tetrahedron, I'm going to forget them now, aren't I?
Yes.
Octahedron, icosahedron, and the dodecahedron. And that's it. You know, you can't make any other shapes in that category. And the next strictest category, the next most important category of shapes, is the Archimedean solids, named after Archimedes. And in that category there are 13 shapes. They still have regular polygons as their faces, but they're not all the same shape. So you could have squares and triangles together in a shape. And with those rules, Archimedes had a list of 13 shapes that fit those rules. Specifically the rules, because this is the important thing, is that the faces are all regular polygons and all the corners are identical. So if you look at any one corner of the shape and sort of say what shapes there are around it, so it might be that it goes square, triangle around each corner, that will be the same everywhere on the shape. And this was Archimedes' definition.
So this is the problem with doing a visual thing audibly. But, and it isn't that there are a lot of Archimedean solids that I'm thinking of are 2 shapes, 2 different regular shapes.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be. It can
No,
be
it can be any combination, as long as all of the shapes that it's made up of are regular polygons.
Yes.
So they're not like right-angled triangles or anything else.
And that there is more than one of them, otherwise it would be a platonic.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess. And so that's kind of Archimedes' definition of these shapes, and the 13 shapes that are called the Archimedean solids all have that property. It's also a slightly stupid category because you have to arbitrarily exclude infinitely many shapes, because all prisms also fit this definition. So if you have kind of 2 equilateral triangles with squares joining them, that's a triangular prism, and that's it fits the rules of an Archimedean solid, but it's part of this category where you could change the triangles for squares and have 4 triangles down the sides. Actually, that's a cube, but you could change them for pentagons and have 5 squares down the sides, or hexagons,
96 sided.
Yeah, any number of sides on the top and bottom.
Yeah.
As long as it's a regular polygon, it still would count. So they have to exclude all prisms, which is infinitely many shapes, and all antiprisms, which are prisms where there's 2 shapes on top and bottom that are oriented differently. So triangles pointing in opposite directions on top and bottom, in which case the sides aren't squares, but they're just more triangles.
Right.
And you can build all of these shapes. If you've got like a set of kind of plastic shapes that you can clip together, or magnets together, or just bits of card with tape, you can play around and make all of these different shapes, because all of the faces are always the same. They're always these regular polygons.
It's excellent having a category of shapes where you just have to exclude infinitely many shapes from
exactly.
to narrow it down.
And it's sort of, I can understand why they've done that, because otherwise it becomes a meaningless definition. But the 13 interesting Archimedean solids are these particular ones that were defined by Archimedes. And I guess, in those days people were really interested in learning about all the possible shapes that there were, so we'll have kind of investigated. But he kind of missed one, I guess, because there is a shape which, for most reasonable definitions of an Archimedean solid, including the one that Archimedes gave, should be in that category. And in fact, people have since revised the definition of an Archimedean solid, made it more strict in order to just exclude this one shape. Because it wasn't on the original list, so it would be weird. And because there is an aspect to it that means that it is different in some way. So it's the pseudo-rhombicuboctahedron, of course. It's based on a rhombicuboctahedron.
Of course.
Which
is a familiar shape to everybody.
As everyone well knows. So it's made of squares and triangles. If you imagine a square with a square attached to each of the four sides, you get like a plus shape. If you kind of bend that upwards in the middle and put triangles in between the squares at the sides, you end up with kind of a little hat. And that shape is known as a cupola, and it's one of the known sort of constructions that you can do. So you can add cupolas onto the faces of things. I think it's a word that's used in architecture for like the roof of a building, if it's a cupola. Okay. And it is essentially a shape where you've got a regular shape in the middle and a square attached to each side. So you could have a pentagon in the middle and 5 squares attached to it with triangles in between. That would give you a pentagonal cupola. And if you stick 2 cupolas back to back, so if you have cupola and then a cupola facing the opposite way immediately attached to it, that's a bicupola.
Right.
If you move the 2 cupolas apart and put a row of squares in between, you get an elongated bicupola. And if it's a square cupola that you started with, you get an elongated square bicupola. And that's the official name of the rhombicuboctahedron. So it's kind of a square hat on top and a square hat on the bottom, and a row of squares around the middle, like a row of 8 squares that kind of join it together.
So you said a lot of things there very quickly. So what are the 2 names of this shape?
It's called a rhombicuboctahedron. It's also called an elongated square bicupola.
Neither of those had pseudo in.
No, because that is the
right,
that's the boring shape. Yes, that is the boring one that is in the Archimedean solids.
But and which of those? So you had several interim shapes there. So you had a cupola, which isn't a shape because it's not finished.
Yes, it's got an open face.
And you had 2 cupolas stuck together. Is that
it's a bicupola? That wouldn't be an Archimedean solid because it's got different types of corners. So the corners on the top of the cupola between the squares and the triangles all look the same. But where the cupola meets the other cupola, you've got squares against squares that kind of come back on themselves
triangles against
quite
triangles.
Sharply.
Yep.
Yeah.
But then stretching it out and putting a row of squares in the middle makes it
all the same. And in fact, you can take that shape and rotate it in any direction, and it will look the same. And the thing that I'm interested in, the shape that I am very sad about at the minute, is called the elongated square gyro bicupola. Which may give you a clue as to how it's created, or may not. But it's also called a pseudorhombicuboctahedron. And effectively, you can make it by taking a rhombicuboctahedron, taking the top cupola off, and turning it round very slightly. So you don't turn it round so much that when you put it back on, you get the same thing, but you turn it round by exactly one shape, so that the triangles on the top are now above squares on the bottom. And it's a wonderful shape. If you Google any of these words, you'll find pictures of these things. But it is basically a twisted rhombicuboctahedron. And it has all the same corners. All the corners are 3 squares in a triangle. If you look at any corner of the shape, it's square, 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 triangle. And the sort of traditional Archimedean definition of all identical corners is satisfied. But you can see why it isn't, like why some people don't think it should be allowed, because it doesn't have that property that whichever way up you place it, it looks the same. So if you rotate it kind of around horizontally, you get something that's quite similar, because you get the sort of pattern of squares and triangles alternating, and it's the opposite alternating on the bottom. But if you rotate it on its side or something like that, then the thing on top of the shape is not a cupola anymore, and that kind of ruins it a little bit. So.
And also, I remember you sent a picture of this a while ago, and it took me quite a while to work out why it wasn't the real one, if you like. And if you look at it, where there's a square on the top cupola is lined up with a triangle on the bottom cupola, and that gives it this sort of asymmetry, which I guess is what people don't like about it.
Yeah, I mean, I find it kind of nice. Like, I like the asymmetry of it, because it's not an asymmetry that's irregular. It's an asymmetry that gives you something that's a pattern.
And there are ways you could rotate it that do. You could flip it over, and it would
if you flip
the same.
Flip it fully 180 degrees over, you get the same shape again. But the more strict definition, I guess, is to do with isometries, which are kind of symmetries of 3D shapes. So it's effectively the condition that you can take one of the corners of the shape, look at it, and go, that's square, 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 triangle. You should be able to rotate the shape and place a different corner in that same spot, and it still be square, 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 triangle, but the rest of the shape will look the same if you do that. Okay. And for the regular rhombicuboctahedron, that will always work. If you put a corner oriented the same way in front of you, the rest of the shape is doing the same thing, but for this one you'll get a slightly different arrangement behind it. So it's sort of a weird one to think about, because Archimedes never thought about shapes in terms of isometries, and that's a much more recent concept.
I see, mathematicians love isometries.
Yeah, they do now, but in
Yes.
those days it wasn't really a thing, I don't think. And there's probably no way that Archimedes would have excluded it on that grounds. There may have been another reason. It may be that Archimedes discovered this shape and went, ugh, and then didn't want to put it in the set of Archimedean solids, or it may be that they just never noticed it. They just didn't spot that this was a thing you could do. But I've started an awareness campaign, essentially, to try and get people talking about this shape, because when you learn about the Archimedean solids, you won't learn about this. No one will mention this one. I mean, I say when you learn about the Archimedean solids, does anyone?
When you're indoctrinated into this.
Yes. Well, absolutely. But, if this is a thing that you're interested in and you think, cubes and tetrahedrons are nice, I wonder what other shapes there are out there. Sure. This might be the next thing you come to, and all the references on Archimedean solids won't necessarily include this shape.
No, I think the thing to say about that is that they usually If anyone talks about Archimedean solids, it's the one that's a football, and some others.
There are more famous Archimedean solids than the normal rhombicubeoctahedron.
And if you sort of hid this one among a pile of Archimedean solids, people probably wouldn't notice.
I guess, I say that you wouldn't normally find out about this. I found out about this by looking at the Wikipedia page for the Archimedean solids, and it specifically says in the third paragraph or so, there is an extra shape that is generally not considered to be an Archimedean solid, but does satisfy the criteria. But
do you know where this sort of thing comes up in education? Because I was thinking about, when you were talking about Platonic solids, I'm aware that the famous ancient book on geometry is Euclid's Elements, and Euclid's Elements starts off with a bunch of axioms and builds up plane geometry. And as far as I understand it, the culmination of that book is the construction of the Platonic solids and a proof that there are only 5 of them.
Yeah.
And that was the sort of text for most of medieval Europe's universities would learn Euclid's Elements, but these days we don't learn so much geometry.
Yeah, I feel like if I stand in front of an audience, I can reasonably expect people to know what a cube is, but I wouldn't necessarily expect people to know what an icosahedron is.
Yes.
And it's a shame, because they're brilliant. All the Platonic solids are great. They'd see one and they'd go, "Is that a football?" No, it's not. That's a truncated icosahedron, you idiot. There's a lot more subtlety to it, but I think the mathematical mind, the mind of a mathematician, is someone who enjoys categorising things, and this is a really rich source of that kind of pedantry. So, the fact that there is this mild controversy in the area,
but it butts up against not being isometric. That's a big additional pedantry to get against.
That's the next level of pedantry, I guess. And there's a paper. So a mathematician called Branko Grunbaum wrote a paper which is called "An Enduring Error," and it's fairly brutal about this entire topic. But it essentially says anyone who doesn't acknowledge that this shape is clearly an Archimedean solid is an idiot, and why would you not think this? And they kind of come up with a proposal at the end, and they say, okay, I appreciate that there are definitions for which this isn't in the category. Let's say the Archimedean solids are these 14 things, including the pseudorhombicuboctahedron, and then we have a separate category, and this is already an existing defined category of solids called uniform polyhedra, and these are things which do satisfy that kind of isometry rule of regularity, I guess. So the uniform polyhedra would then not include the pseudorhombicuboctahedron, and that's fine, but it would be in the Archimedean solids.
So uniform would be the 13 and the Platonic solids?
Yes. And maybe the prisms. Again, maybe you'd have to let the prisms and anti-prisms in there as well. But it's a subtly different definition, which wouldn't necessarily include this, but it should be allowed its place in the thing. So it's a nice little paper, but it's basically clearly this is stupid. Why are we doing this? Let's allow this. And it's maybe the kind of thing that 99% of people will never notice, but essentially what I'm now doing is I've done a YouTube video, I've talked about this on stage at events, and I have now also, a friend of mine with a 3D printer has 3D printed me some little pseudorhombicuboctahedrons. I've told people about this. I put the links on my YouTube video to the 3D printing files. Someone has actually printed some and put them on their Christmas tree and sent me a picture, which was really nice, that the word is getting out there. And it's, it's a nice shape if artists are looking to do sort of geometric things, or those tedious people that produce housewares that are somehow geometric.
Yep.
If they started using this shape as well,
you could put a candle in it.
You could put so many candles in that. It would look great. Yeah.
Very good.
So that is my object that I am championing.
Very good. Right. So we should say we are people who exist in the world. You could tweet us. I'm at Peter Rowlett on Twitter, ROWLETT. You are
at Steckles, STECKS.
We both blog at a site called aperiodical.com, which is periodical with an A on the front, I guess, how you spell it. You could email us if you want to talk to us or suggest an object or anything like that at objects@aperiodical.com.
Yeah,
right.
We'll see you next time.
Yeah, bye-bye.
The music is Funk Game Loop by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons.